And welcome to the Full Stack with Angular workshop. I'm Tim, and I'm going to be guiding you through this workshop, and we're going to learn how to develop in Angular a bit. So it should be a lot of fun and should be very helpful for any quick project you want to come up with that's going to use some Angular, it's going to use some Firebase, it's going to use some routing. You'll have auth, you'll have storage, and you'll really be able to get a lot of things up very quickly. So just first off, some dependencies here. Really all you need for this workshop, just at the onset, is something called the Angular CLI. So if I go into my terminal here, I already have it installed, but if we search for it, it's going to look like Angular CLI. And you want to install this globally. So do some sort of npm I -g and then Angular/CLI. And I should already have it installed, so this might update, but will likely not do anything. And we can see on the left here that one of these is Angular CLI at least. So yeah, it's actually updating for me. I guess mine was slightly out of date. And that's going to allow us to very quickly create an Angular application, add new features, lint, basically the whole shebang. Right. So we've got the CLI here. Next, what you're going to do is run something called ngx, or just ng actually in this instance. So if we run ng, we can see that this will give us all of our options for the Angular CLI version. I'm just using, happens to be using the local version. So we can list all the available commands and their short descriptions. Let's just do that really quickly. Ng help. Right, we can see we've got generate, we've got build, deploy. There's some linting stuff, making a new workspace or a new Angular app, test, update. So really, this is going to be your home page for running everything associated with your Angular application. The thing we're going to worry about right now is just going to be ng new. I'm not going to run it, but if you want to, we can see what it does, right, by ng new --help. And this will give you a new Angular directory with pretty much everything set up. Scrolling up, let me make this a little bigger. Right, and you just do ng new followed by the name, and that will give us everything. And it'll also give us an initial commit. There's plenty of options, plenty of parameters. You can do plenty here. So now, once we've got our whole thing up and running, I again haven't done that, but you should do that on your machine, ng new your project, for example. We are going to run ng generate. So I'll run that with the help command just to see what it does. So we have all of these schematics that we can generate using ng generate. And these represent different building blocks of our Angular application. We're only going to be focusing on a few today, and I'm going to go over them very quickly, just briefly, and there will be more information in the README for the workshop if you want to get a quicker look at that. So primarily, one of the most important building blocks for our Angular application has to do with the views, right? Because we want to actually be able to demonstrate and render different views to the user. The component schematic, or the component building block here, is going to be responsible for that. So there's a couple different pieces to a component. If I click in source, we can see some of them here under the app. So you have a CSS file per component, you have an HTML file per component, and you also have a TypeScript file per component. There's also the spec file, but we don't have to worry about that for now. So we can see that the CSS has whatever CSS. In this case, I haven't given it any because I'm using an external styling library. This just has a router outlet here, so I wouldn't worry about it too much either. And then you can see that this contains our actual, the logic of our code. But what you need to know, and hopefully you know a little bit of this already, TypeScript file contains the logic for interfacing with things. HTML file is responsible for the actual content, and the CSS file is responsible for what our content looks like. So styling, what content is actually displayed, and how we kind of interact with that content, and what can the user do. The next important building block here is going to be a module. A module just encapsulates a particular aspect of our application. We don't really have to worry about modules too much because our application is relatively simple. But if you had, for example, part of your application that was responsible for an API and another part of the application that was responsible for a front-end view, you might distinguish those using two separate modules, an API module and a front-end module. So you can just think of a module as a little piece of your code, a little encapsulation, just to allow you to more effectively modularize your code, hence the term, and integrate just pieces of your application into other, across your entire application. And the last important thing for Angular is just a service. You can see here we have a couple services, and they're really just governed by a TypeScript file. And all a service really is just some sort of logic that you want to encapsulate and reuse across the board. So here we've got an auth service, and here we've got a login service, and we're going to be getting into implementing both of these. But just think of this as logic that doesn't really need to be displayed to the user, right? Our authentication is handled exclusively on the back end, exclusively using our APIs, so we don't actually need to tell the user anything about that. We can just have the component service rely on that, and then the component service will actually handle that, the rendering and whatever interfacing to display results to the user that's needed. But for our authentication itself, and for logging in and registering, we don't need a view for the actual backend logic there. And just really quickly, let's speak into the module code. It's not going to be super interesting here. You can see we have a couple of declarations. This is basically all the components that we're going to be using in our app. We've got our login component, we've got our home component. Here we have all our imports of things that we're also using in our app. So we've got the browser module, which kind of allows you to render things. We've got a couple things for Firebase as well. We've got routing, and these are for, this is for initializing Firebase, and then we've got storage as well as authentication. And here is a material design button module and a forms module, just to make things a little nicer without having to implement CSS by ourselves. So here we can see that I've actually created a new test application that we're just going to be working in for ease of clarity. And I've added Angular routing, and I've just said we're going to use CSS because that happens to be just very simple. I created all these files, and that's all in a new directory, so I'm going to hop in there and catch right back up with you. All right, so I've hopped in that test directory, and I've gone to this app routing module.ts file. This has already been provided for us. All of this has, and this is going to allow us to enable routing in our application, which is going to allow the users to go to new pages, send redirects, actually associate routes with particular views and components, and that's just going to be very, very helpful for us. Save a little time. I'm not going to type all of this out, but the routes that we're going to need are just the default route. This is just a normal slash, and this is going to redirect to our home page. We have to have this path match full here because otherwise it will try to match anything with, nothing, which happens to be everything because, you can form an empty string without anything. So having this path match full means that only the empty route will redirect to home. Similarly, if we're actually going to, home, that's going to render our home component, and we're going to say, we'll get into this a little later as well, that this component can only be rendered if our auth service is present. So we haven't made that yet, so that's why there's a red bar there. But if we're not authorized to actually be in the application, if we're not yet logged in, this component will actually not render. Similarly, we have the login. This just renders login component. You can see it doesn't have a can activate, right? Because to log in, you should not already be logged in. that is actually what is responsible for logging you in. And now we have these 2 stars, which represent the wildcard route. This is anything that is not just empty, home, or login. So if I were to type in like cheese, it would just redirect to home as well. So pretty much home is kind of our, that's our landing page, that's our main guy, and login is just going to be responsible for the authentication, right? And we'll see later on that our auth service is actually also going to redirect to login, right? So if you're not logged in, you're going to be in login. If you are logged in, you'll pretty much be in home. So that's kind of the overall logic of our routing module. So now what I've just done is I have created a new component. You can actually use a lot of shortcuts in this Angular command line interface. And I've just said I'm going to generate, right? That's the G. I'm going to make a component when I'm generating. That's the schematic there. So this is that C for component, and I'm going to call it home. And we can see that we have created 4 files. Angular kind of detects where to put those files, right? It's under our source, our app, and now our home. And we've got our HTML, we've got our TS TypeScript file, and we've got our CSS styling file as well. So most of what we're going to be worried about in the home component is going to be with kind of rendering a view to the user. This is kind of going to be our main page. And to do that, we are going to leverage a different library called Material. So I've installed the Angular Material library, run ng add, and then @angular/material. I picked the theme indigo/pink. That was just the first one. Seems pretty nice. Said yes to getting the typography styles and no to browser animations because we're not really going to be going into those in this particular workshop. So I've gone ahead and I've done a couple things here. Primarily what I've done is comment out some of these lines that will prevent our program from compiling as it is right now. We've not yet implemented our auth service, and we don't yet have our login component, so we're going to ignore this for now. We do have our home component, and so what I've done down here is actually call ng-serve. And I'll show you what that looks like, but I won't run it because I already have an instance running. Just call ng-serve. What this is going to do is allow us to build and hot reload, aka not have to fully rebuild the application whenever we make a file change, and allow us to view our application in our web browser, which is going to be very, very nice. Right now, the home component is only rendering this home works as a paragraph tag. Again, quick refresher, HTML tags, embed the text inside, and this will render as a paragraph. So as we can see here, we've got our application, and we'll talk about why this entire thing is present, and it's not just this little homeworks paragraph tag down here. But it's great that we can run things, and we're going to see how to customize and modify very soon. So right now, I am in the app.component.html. This is what actually renders as the main feature of our application, and the routing is actually handled within this larger application component. What that means is that we have all of this template HTML that has been provided to us that is rendering on the screen. We don't want that because we just want our standalone application. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete all of that. But as I just said, the router actually is embedded, in a sense, within this component. So what we need to do is just add a router outlet tag, and then we will still be able to see our rendered application. So I've swapped over, and as we can see, all we have is this home, and we have this logout button here. You're probably wondering why the design of the home and the logout isn't exactly the prettiest, right? We should have set this logout button to be a material button, but it's not showing up properly. So here we have the app module, and something pretty important that we have to do to actually get our material buttons to work is include that module within our greater app module. So we can see that we have the map button module down at the bottom. We've imported everything up from the Angular material button as well. And down below, what I've actually done is rerun that ng-serve command, right? And so in case things aren't working exactly correctly, right, because re-adding that module might be a little tricky, we got to rerun that ngserve command down at the bottom. What I've done now is I've gone ahead and run ngGC login, right? And that has generated the login component that we can see on the left side here. So if we go and we click on that, we can see, right, we've got our login works, pretty standard, what we expected. And now what we can actually do is go back to our routing module and uncomment what we had commented out earlier, because now we actually do have that login component. And we do have to remember to import it from that correct directory as well. So we've got from./login/login.component. And we see it auto rebuild. And I've gone ahead and I have modified the HTML for that login page. So we've got a pretty basic page right now. We've just got that H1 with the login page, and then that same button primary with the click to sign in. Now, what's pretty unique here about Angular is you might be familiar, for example, with onClick and event handlers like that in JavaScript and HTML. But in here, right, we can see we don't have sign in yet, but what we do have is this click parentheses. And this is kind of like an output event in Angular, is what they're called. And so there's a couple of ways of actually doing data transfer. But for propagating events outward, propagating events to other events, right, we have this parentheses type syntax where we are actually capturing that click event. And as a result of that, right, whenever this button itself is clicked, we are going to then call our sign-in method that we're going to implement in the login.component.ts file. So we'll see a couple other ways to handle that data transfer, but this is a very core one. So now in the service here, there's a couple of things to go over. I've included these next 3 lines after the injectable, right, which will allow us to use the services that I've just included. So we've got Angular FireAuth, which is going to handle our authentication. We're using some other stuff from Firebase as well, so I've just, imported that as a wildcard. And we've also got the observable type. And we'll go into what all of these mean, really, especially the observable type. But first, what's most noteworthy right now is this injectable thing that is actually given to you by default. And this is, what that service looks like. What an injectable is every service is an injectable. That is how services are provided within your Angular application. They are injected whenever they are used. So if you never use a service, it's never actually injected and it's never actually instantiated, which allows Angular to be relatively performant, right? Because if a user is only using 1 or 2 services when you have tens and even hundreds, then all you have to really do is provide those 1 or 2 services versus, the 10s, 20s, however many services you might actually have. And what's also really nice about services like this and injectables is that they are only rendered and only used once across your entire application. So they're kind of like a singleton, if you're familiar with that. There is one instance of this login service, and it's going to be used across our entire application. So if we ever need a different login service, we would have to create a new service, but this has the great advantage of keeping your code really, really performant, because the first time that we use the login service, it's created. But if we ever need to reuse that service, which is, relatively likely, all we have to do is provide it, and it will just be reused within our application. And there's some nuances here with the modules, such as this is provided in root, but for our purposes, we don't have to worry about this so much. So for this next step, you're going to actually need a Firebase account. So what I've done is I have gone on, made an account, this one's called VH7 Angular, and then I have made an app within that called Test. And within this, you will get an SDK, which will just be basically a set of scripts for you to use in your web app. Obviously, we are not just using native JavaScript, so we don't need to copy everything, but there is a configuration variable in there that I have copied, and now I will paste into my application within the environments file so that I can use it to actually initialize my Firebase. So you go ahead and you put that environment variable in this file, and that will give us all the parameters that we need. It is a very good idea to keep this environment, this particular configuration private, because otherwise people can just boot into your app without your actual explicit authorization. So I'm going to go ahead and re-include this, and we can see on how to set up the Firebase instance. So now that I'm back in here, we can see that I've included some other things that we're going to be using just for general Firebase storage on line 4, for the actual storage on line 5, and on line 6 for the authorization. I've also included the environment that we're going to need to actually initialize our Firebase config. Now, down here in our imports, we have to tell our application that we are going to be using Firebase. So I've just copied and pasted that in here, right? We're just saying that this module needs to be initialized with the config that we declared before, that you copy pasted from the website. And we are also telling it that we're going to be using the Firestore and the Fire Auth. So now for some login implementations. So now we're back in the login service. There's really only one private thing that we need for the login service, and that's going to be our unique instance of this Firebase application. Remember, as before, because that's an injectable, it's a module and a service similar to everything else. All we need to do is include it once, and it's going to be mimicked across our entire application. So let's just call that Fire Auth, and it can be an instance of Angular Fire Auth. Right, so now we've got this, Angular Fire Auth here, and we can use it down here. So first, let us create a method called login. And off the top of your head, you might not actually know what this is going to return, but reading the API, we know that this returns a promise firebase.auth.user credential. So I've just copy paste this from somewhere else. And again, this is not necessarily necessary. TypeScript does not need to be explicitly typed, but it is helpful to have, just because it makes everything a lot more clear when you're passing things around. You know whether they're actually synchronous, whether they're asynchronous, what those types actually are. And so catching these things during development can save a lot of time in actually debugging and just verifying that your code is correct. I've also gone ahead and changed this to be sign-in just because of the naming convention that we already used. It's going to prevent us from having to change that back. So very easy, actually. All we have to do is call this Fire Auth, and we are going to sign in with pop-up. And this does that thing that I'm sure you're very, very familiar with, where it says, sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, sign in with Microsoft or whatever. And instead of having to handle passwords ourselves, having the user register a new account just for our service, we're just going to say, okay, let's just use your Google account. Pretty much everyone has one of those, and for sure everyone in this workshop, because you need one to actually create the Firebase instance. And we're just going to say, hey, let's just use that for ease of implementation. Of course, you can choose a different sign-in method if you'd like, but that's just what I'm going to be going with here because it is very streamlined and very simple. So we have to pass it a parameter, and in this case, it's taking a Firebase auth provider. So we're going to create one of those. Sorry, this shouldn't be this. Firebase.auth.Google auth provider. And this needs parentheses as well because it is a constructor. And it can be seen that our return type is still erroring up a little bit, so we just need to return this. Yep. And that will give us a promise of whether or not the user is actually signed in. And if they are signed in, right, we're going to be able to access their user credential, assuming that that promise resolves properly. Now, what we're going to need is the sign up method. Sorry, I misspoke. I actually just misremembered a bit. Because we're signing in using Google, we don't actually have to handle sign up, right? Which is another reason that this is so helpful. So now what we actually do need is this promise void. And I'm going to mark these with public just for clarity. Don't necessarily need to be public per se, but passing things around can otherwise get kind of weird. And of course, we do have the intention of using this login service not only in this class, but throughout our application. So marking things with public is just a good idea semantically. And this, again, is very easy. We just want to sign out and just return that value, right? So that's what's really nice about working with Firebase and really nice about working with APIs. We can implement this authorization functionality without very much code at all and without having to worry about security risks for ourselves, things of that nature. So now we are going to implement the isLoggedIn method. Again, you can look at the documentation to come up with the actual return type here. I'm just doing it as well. And we do need an isLoggedIn method for our authentication guard that I mentioned earlier. We need to know whether or not the user is logged in, because if they are logged in, they can access our landing page, our home page. But if they're not logged in, we want to redirect them to that login page. And I don't believe we've gone over observables yet, but you can just think of these as Angular's / RxJS's version of promises. They're slightly different in that you can actually subscribe to them and access values kind of as they come in. So you can think of this as like a stream of values, and as soon as one shows up, you can work with it. But for our cases, all we're needing is that one return call with the user instance, so we can think of them as a promise. Sorry, not user state, and that's going to be auth state. So that's it for our login service. We've got everything in here, and now we can go ahead and implement our authentication service, which is actually going to allow us to verify on a particular page whether or not that user is logged in and is authenticated. So now, really quickly, we're going to hop back into our routing module, and because we're about to implement this, I am going to uncomment this line about the auth service. Right, I've just generated it down here. We're about to implement it, so we're pretty much good to go on that. I am also going to import that from, we haven't really exported it yet, but I'll be fine. We will get that to work. It's not actually in a sub-level folder here, right? So a little different from the components, which are a little more encapsulated, but yep. So now we have access to that service, and once we implement it, we are going to have this can activate property be actually set to the service, right? Or actually an array of the services, plural, which you can use, but because we're only using one service, we just have that singular entry in our array. And you can see here, can activate is used to look up whether this user is allowed to activate the component, right? By default, anyone can activate it, but we want to make sure that that user is verified. So we are implementing our auth service to handle that. And there's actually a couple of things that we have to do with the auth service in order to make this work, namely have it inherent from a parent route guard class, as they're kind of known. These are route guards because they guard routes against unauthorized users. But once we set up everything correctly, then this should work exactly as intended. Now we're going to go ahead and implement this auth service, and to do so, we're going to need a couple of imports, which I'm going to explain what these all do. So first, I mentioned that this needs to be a route guard, right? So what we're doing here is we are getting this can activate interface, right? And as long as a route implements this can activate interface, then it can be used as a route guard. So if all guards return true, navigation continues. If any of them return false, navigation is canceled, right? We're only using the one guard here, so whether or not it returns true or false will determine if the user is allowed to access that page. Similarly, we also need the router just for related tasks. We're going to be making use of the login service to actually verify whether the user is logged in. We need observables again, just for kind of type things, and we're also going to be using map for an implementation that we'll get to in a bit. So as part of the auth service, we're going to need both an instance of the login service so let's just call this login service. And we are going to need an instance of the router. So let's just call that router as well. Now, the key thing, right, that we mentioned is it has to implement this can activate interface. So we're going to set that to be true. And now we can see, okay, what do we actually need for can activate? Well, we need a can activate method, right, which is required by this interface. So let's create one of those. Can activate. And what's the return type of this going to be? Well, it can actually be a lot of things. It can be just a Boolean value. It can be a promise. It can be an observable. In this case, we're going to go with an observable just because that is what our auth service is already working with. And so having an observable is going to, prevent some of those tricky conversions that we might otherwise have to do. And because we're using asynchronous data, it is pretty important that it is either a promise or an observable. Otherwise, you're not really going to wait for that request to actually resolve. So let's just make an observable Boolean here. We're going to say that our status is whether or not the user is logged in. And now, not the most difficult return, but something that we do need to think about and something that you're probably, it's probably relatively new to you. So this pipe command just allows you to use other functional commands, basically, in Angular, in particular for observables, right? Because we know that status is an observable with that Firebase.user. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to map this status to the return type that we want, right? So that user that we get from our service, right? Because we know that our status is an observable with the Firebase.user, right? So we're going to take that user and we're going to perform some functions on it, and that overall return type will be an observable Boolean, which will determine whether or not our user is logged in, right? So let's just do this rather simply. User is null, right? If we don't actually have a user, then let's just log that need to log in. And we actually want to redirect the user in this case, right? And that's why we've included that router to actually handle this. And we want to redirect them to login. And router has a couple parameters here. This navigate method in particular. But we are just saying we're going to use the absolute URL. So here login, we have the app, so no matter where they are on the page, they will be redirected. And something pretty important that we have to do to actually get our material buttons to work. Another thing about this module within our pipe method is that it kind of wraps everything. So we can see that we have the map button module down at the bottom. So we've imported just by returning false here. Once we come out into the pipe and the map. And down below, what I've actually done is rerun that ng-serve command, I guess, if you want to use promise language in a false. In case things aren't working exactly correctly, right, because not re-adding that module might be a little tricky. True. We've got to rerun that ng-serve command down. In fact, able to log in. So, yeah, that's it. That's all we need for the guard. Ahead and run ng really briefly. GC. We've got our login service, we've got our router, and so if the user's not logged in, that we can see on the left side here. So, and if they are, then they can access the route. So, overall, pretty simple and very effective at actually preventing unauthorized users. Now what we can actually do is go back to our routing module. Now let's verify that this actually works by going into both our login component and our. We do have to remember too what the behavior actually is, that we've implemented all of these different functions from /login. I spoke a little too soon here, and we do actually need to implement a few more things in our login component, but this is going to be relatively simple because I've gone ahead and I have modified the HTML. So let's take advantage of that login service. So we've got a pretty basic page right now. We've just got that H1 with the login page, and then that same button primary with the click to sign in. Now, what's pretty unique here about Angular is you might be familiar, for example, with onClick and event handlers like that in JavaScript and HTML. But in here, right, we can see we don't have sign-in yet. But what now for sign-in, all we really need to do is, and this is kind of like an output event in Angular, is what they're called. And so there's a couple of ways of actually doing data transfer. But for propagating events outward, propagating events to other events, right, we have this parentheses type syntax where we are actually capturing that click event, and as a result of that, right, whenever this button itself is clicked, I think does need a signature is what this message is saying. We'll just call it void that we're going to implement in the login.component. And we know that sign in is returning a promise. So we'll see a couple other ways that promise resolves data transfer, but this is a very core one. And this is just going to be any success, so we'll just call it E or whatever. And in this instance, we actually want to redirect the user to the home page. So to do that, right, we still need our router. So let's import that really quickly. And create that down here as well. And now we can use that call to navigate to that home page. Yeah, so very seamless, and let's see this in action. The last thing we need to do is actually hop into our Firebase console and make sure that we have Google enabled as a sign-in provider. You can just find this under authentication, then go to sign-in method. Overall, not particularly tricky to do, just something that you have to remember, otherwise you're going to have some errors. All right, so now I'm going to log in. And I just got a pop-up, but I don't believe you can see it. I'm going to choose to continue with my school email. And now that I continue with my school email, I have been shown to our homepage, right? And this would not load before, right? We tried it earlier, and because of those route guards, it wouldn't actually load. And we can try this as soon as we implement the logout functionality, which is, again, relatively simple to do. Right, in exactly the same vein as before, we are going to do exactly what we just did. Just kind of the converse, or I guess the inverse, that we did in our login component, right? So there we were logging in. Now we just want to log out. So we're going to need the router. We're going to need the login service. Going to make these both private variables, just as we did before. And now for sign out, all we want to do is, sorry, not this dot sign out, this dot login service dot sign out. This returns a promise that resolves in void. Again, we don't really care necessarily what it resolves in, but we just want it to resolve. Once that user is indeed signed out, we are going to redirect them back to the login page, because that is actually the only page that can be accessed using or without being signed in, right? Because of our route guard that we implemented earlier. Again, relatively simple, and just formatted everything. And let's see this in action as well. So now we're back on our home page. We have our logout button here. See that it redirected us to the login page. And now let's just try navigating to home without actually being logged in. And we see that clearly doesn't work, right? We just go right back to the login page. And if we type in any route, right, like cheese, that'll match to the home page. But because the home page isn't authorized, we just go right back to the login page. And if we check our console here, right, we should see that need to log in, right? That console log message that we set up earlier in our route guard is actually printing out here, right? Because we are not logged in. However, if we just simply log in, back to home. And we could even navigate back to login here. And because we haven't logged out yet, we should be able to go straight to home without even logging in, that we don't yet have that functionality implemented. So now we're going to extend the functionality of our landing page component here just to demonstrate the capabilities of Firebase, particularly when it comes to real-time data storage, which I personally think is pretty cool. I believe it's Firestore from Firebase, sorry, Angular/Fire/Firestore. Sorry, it is Angular Firestore, actually. All right, so now that we've got that imported, we're going to add it to the list of services that we're using as well. We'll just call this one Firestore. And now we're going to implement some methods that allow us to actually interface with the data. And what's really nice about this is that the Angular Firestore is actually set up based on the config that we have already implemented. So we don't really have to do anything else out of the box to get this to work correctly. Primarily, let's just head first to our HTML because we actually need a way to call to this particular component. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy in a form that I've already made. And we can just inspect that, how that works. So we've got our standard form HTML element, this label, an input, as well as a create item button, right? So not actually submitting the form per se, but just creating the item, which is a method that we're going to implement right after this. So I mentioned before this click handler here, and this is what's known as kind of like an output event. Or an output data transfer, right? There's one-way data transfer in Angular, and there's actually two methods of that, and there's also two-way data transfer, bidirectional. This is that one-way data transfer. By placing the value that we want in double squiggly brackets, we can actually interpolate it and represent what that value is as part of this label. Obviously, because the label itself has no, place to put input, we just need to get the one-way value of what the label is and bring it forward into our application. This is the two-way data transfer that is present in Angular. And this is a feature that isn't really that available in a lot of other languages. The way to do this in other languages is actually quite different, or other frameworks, I mean. Just give it a name of dummy for easy access, just a dummy kind of item. And this will both update as well as render item at the same time, kind of all in this one very, very short block of code here. And if you've ever tried to make a live representation of, for example, an input field and kind of handling how to update your parameters in that, that usually it actually requires a little bit more work than this, but this is very, very lightweight, very robust as well. And Angular just kind of comes with that out of the box. So all you need is this brace with the parentheses, the ng model, and then that refers to a particular variable that you've already instantiated in your TypeScript class, right? We've already been over what this button does on click. We're going to do that create item. So now let's head over to the TypeScript class and begin implementing this stuff. So primarily, one of the first things that we need is a variable called item. And we'll just default that right now to be an empty string. And we can actually already play around with this now that we just have this item and see what that looks like in the browser. So before we actually go ahead with that, there is one more thing that we need to make this ng model type of thing work. So this ng model is actually built into the Angular Forms module, which is a very helpful module, right, for working with these kinds of inputs because it allows us to simplify our logic in such a strong way. You can also, of course, do this two-way binding with your own user-defined class, but to use the HTML typical forms, you do need to have that form module declared in your app module. So We can see right here, I've put it in the imports, and I have imported it from @angular / or /forms. / Yeah, so now we can actually see what that looks like in the browser. So we can see we've got that text box and we've got the create button. And if I were to just type in, a bunch of random letters, we can see that they are all popping up on the left side, right? This is our input binding. That's our one-way data transfer. And this is our two-way data transfer, actually modifying the underlying value. And it's pretty nice, right? Because it's not even like keystroke dependent. So if I, let's say, just copy pasted this, it would update directly, right? I just cut that out, paste it back, paste it a couple more times, and it updates, as you would expect it. This value exactly mimics this because this value assigns that item that we created in our TypeScript file to be whatever is in the input box. So overall, very helpful. And we're going to be using that to create some real-time data storage. So for now, just for creating this item, we are not really going to worry about the return type. All we have to do is call our Firestore thing, get the particular collection that we want. I'll just call this collection items. So we have items. Sorry, it actually takes that as a parameter. Collection items, and we are going to add this data, and we will say that the item that we are passing is going to, well, actually, it needs an overall JSON object with all the data, and we'll say that this JSON object has the value for item as our value of item. All right, fantastic. Let's see this in action, and we're going to use the Firebase Console itself to kind of get a feel for what's going on in real time. So what we might need as well is the database. So you can choose between the Firestore, the real-time database, and the storage. We're just going to be using Firestore for now, just for some quick startup. And we're going to start in test mode, which will allow us read-write access for all clients for 30 days, which is just great for getting up and running very, very fast. Now that we actually have this database, I am going to make a collection. And we titled our collection, if you remember, items. So this is going to have, right, example collection users will contain a unique document for each user, and this is going to have a unique item, just, for our tests. Of course, you could do this programmatically, but just for ease of access and for showing this a little more quickly, I'm going to be doing this using this UI. And apparently we have to give it a document. It doesn't really matter what it's going to be, so we'll just set that it's equal to null, and we can delete this later as well. Now let's see this in action. I've gone ahead and I have cleaned up all the items in here. Now, if we go back to our application, let's see if creating an item actually does what we're intending to do. So for now, I'll just say this is a test. Say create. And what do you know? We've got our new document, item, this is a test. Just to show you that this isn't happening, by chance or randomly, or I'm kind of not making this up. I'm just going to mash my hands on the keyboard. Copy this, I guess, create that, and we can see that presumably this matches because nothing changed. I guess it's kind of hard to see. All right, one more then. Let's just do I have a head. Okay, so obviously I have a head because I'm talking to you. So there we go. There's a test. We've got our flagellas, and I have a head. Pretty cool that it actually happens in real time. And it's a little difficult to demonstrate virtually, but you don't even need to refresh this web page to see this actually happen. So very, very quickly and very easily, we have gotten cloud storage enabled on our web application, which is incredible. So while our current functionality is all well and good, and clearly we are getting data, or clearly we are creating data and putting it on the cloud, it's a little bit meaningless without actually seeing that data in our application itself. So let's figure out a way to do that. So I pasted in this button here. It's just styled, it's a flat button, just for a little bit of spice. And we have this render items method now that we are going to implement. And this will actually allow us to render the items that we have been putting into our cloud store. Right? And you can see that, okay, render items doesn't exist yet, right? Because we haven't implemented it yet. So let's try that. Again, mostly for ease here, I'll just call this a void. And our general train of logic here is we are going to have a empty data set to begin with. I'm going to say, okay, I have an array of data, and that just starts off as empty. But once our data comes back from the server, we're going to actually update that data array. And then our HTML component, using some cool Angular tricks that I'll talk about soon, we'll be able to see that this data array actually has data in it and then update its own view without having to resort to the JavaScript itself, which I think is very neat. So just to prevent some weird loading issues, I'm going to set data array equal to the empty array first so that while things are loading, it's cleared out based on what we're going to do later. Now we need to create a reference to our collection that we had before. Just doing this in 2 lines now for a little bit of ease. We're going to get this reference, and this creates some options, but again, that's not super important. But what's important is that we get an observable for this. And we are going to subscribe to this observable, which whenever a value is returned, will give us a new value. And it'll pass that as the callback to the subscribe function. In this case, we're not going to worry too much about a stream of values, but we do want to get all the values that are currently present when we hit that render items button. So there's actually, for subscribe in this case, there's kind of one intermediate step that we actually get a query of things that we're returning. But we just want to say for everything, for everything in that query, the data is the element data, and then we are just going to push that onto our data array. So just to review quickly what's happening here, right? We reset our data array to be empty. We get a reference to our collection that we've been adding items to. And then we call this get, which will return a basically an asynchronous object, which we can then say, okay, what was the result of that query? Well, for every element in the query, we want its data, which is going to be represented by this data function. And then for all that data, we are going to push, not this data array. We are going to push that data to our data array. So let's see, and my linter added some things, but let's see this actually in action. So I've come out here and we've got our render button, which unfortunately doesn't have any color to it. But once I click render, we should see everything, pop up here, right? Well, not quite, right? We have not yet implemented our HTML. And what's really, really cool about Angular in this instance is that you can actually perform a lot of the logic of rendering your data or your input or your images, whatever you might need to render within the HTML, right? Without having to resort to JavaScript itself, which can be much, much easier when all you really need to do is care about what the component looks like relative to other things within your view. And so keeping all that in the HTML can be very convenient, and we're going to see a couple of key pieces that Angular uses to make that process possible. So I've come back in here. First of all, I have given our render button a little bit of color just to add some spice to life, because why not have some spice in your life? No one really likes bland food. Now I'm just going to create a div which is going to represent our rendered items. Now I'm going to be using a very special Angular construct called ngIf. Basically, what this means is that if this statement evaluates to true, we'll render this div. If it evaluates to false, we won't render this div. This gives you a very nice way to conditionally select things in Angular and conditionally render portions of your component and portions of your views without having to resort to JavaScript, for example. So we'll say ngIf that data array not equal to null. Then we're going to render this div. And just to see that that's working, let's illustrate it with a test here. And we should be able to see that when the data array is not null, that test will show up, and when it is null, that div won't even be in our HTML DOM at all. And sorry, I've actually modified this slightly to be if data array.length is not equal to, well, that's just a typo. It should be if data array.length is not equal to 0. And this is just a little bit more robust than checking for null, right? This will perform coercions. And a good way to see if the array is actually empty, because we start off with an empty array, and whenever we load, we also reset to an empty array. Now going over here, first of all, we can see our new gorgeous button, which is like pink or something. I am red-green colorblind, so that's a little bit of an issue for me. But we notice, hey, no test. Okay, well, let's see if it does show up when we in fact hit render. And there it is. Pretty incredible, right? With the ngIf directive that we just used, we can actually conditionally render certain elements of the DOM. We also set the array to be null while this thing is loading, and of course you could have, instead of loading symbol and things like that. But let's see if this test clears out while it's loading. And it does, and it shows back up just as we expect. Now, hopping back into our code, I'm just going to create a list, and this is going to represent our list of items. Now, it's kind of tricky to know how many items we're going to have, right? Because a user could add more items, and so we don't really have a good way of knowing that. And HTML natively doesn't have the best tools to allow us to conditionally generate, programmatically based on the number of items that we actually have, an item, for each item in our data array. However, Angular has a directive to fix this. And this is the ng4 directive, which is incredibly helpful. So ng4, we're going to say, okay, for something, we are going to, be allowed to use that. So here we have HTML tag app module, and it will actually, and something pretty important that we have to do to iterate over all the buttons to work is items include that module within our greater app module. So we can see that we have the map button module down at the bottom. We've imported everything up from the Angular material button as well. And down below, what I've actually done is rerun that ng-serve command, right? And so in case things aren't working exactly correctly, right, because re-adding that module might be a little tricky, we got to rerun that ng-serve command. So hopefully we should see what I've done now is I've gone ahead and run the item itself for every item in our data array login, right? And that is generated the login very component looking at this, that we can see on the left side here. So we are rendering for if we go and we click on that our data array, remember we can see, right, we've got our login works, pretty standard. However, it appears that the item that is being returned is the entire our routing module. And so what can we do about this? Well, there are a couple of solutions that we can take in the component. First, we do have to remember to import it from here, as well. So gets the actual item parameter from ./login, what that looks like, /login.component. And we can now see that when we click the render button, rebuild. And I've gone ahead and I've modified the HTML for that's exactly what we
pretty
anticipated.
basic page
So
right now.
pretty cool that we can actually get such
H1 with the login page, and then that same button,
iteration support, and really support for you're
now,
always
what's pretty
working with,
unique here about
data
Angular
in
is
arrays or in
you might be
lists or
familiar, for
things of
example,
that
with
nature.
OnClick
And
and
natively
event handlers
using
like
Angular
that in
with the
JavaScript
HTML,
and
we can iterate
HTML.
through these data structures and actually
But in
render
here, right, we can
something
see we don't have
uniform
find
to
it
each data
yet,
structure
but what we
with,
do have
of course,
is this
very,
click
very
parentheses.
little code.
And this is
as
kind of
we
like
just
an
saw
output
in the
event in
NG
Angular,
core
is what they're
directive, right?
called.
This
And
is
so there's a
barely
couple of
anything and
ways of
should
actually doing
look
data
relatively
transfer.
familiar.
But for propagating
This is
events
almost
outward,
Pythonic,
propagating events
I would say.
to other events, right, we
That's pretty
have
much
this
all
parentheses
for our
type syntax
workshop,
where
but
we are actually
I will
capturing that
say
click
that
event.
there
And as a
are
result
a
of that,
million
right,
things
whenever
that
this
you can
button
do
itself
in
is
Angular.
clicked, we are
It
going
is
to
a
then
very
call our sign-in method
robust
that we're going
framework.
to
It's
implement
constantly
in the
changing. It's constantly being
login.component.ts
updated, and it is also, at this
so
point,
we'll see
quite
a couple other
large.
ways
So
to handle that
the
data
amount of
transfer,
opportunity
but
you
this
have
is
with
a very
Angular
core one.
is quite endless. Something else that's really nice about Angular is their documentation and their resources. So we can see, right, we have getting started, main concepts, built-in features. So really, if there's anything that you want to know how to do with Angular, not only can you, just look it up on something like Stack Overflow or on Google, but Angular itself has fantastic resources, right? We can see there's development resources, education resources, community resources, and so just some of the best documentation that I personally have seen in a framework, which really eases getting into it, really eases adding new features, learning the features, and just creating a robust and successful web application. So I really hope that you can use Angular and use Firebase for some of your hackathon projects. I really think it cuts down on the ramp up time a lot with things like auth, things like routing, just being able to generate that HTML more quickly, like we saw with some of those conditional directives and that for directive as well. So I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you enjoy Vandy Hacks as well. Thanks so much.